Hello and welcome to Jekyll and Hyde Annotate with me. We are now on Chapter 6, Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. You might want to pause the video here so you can go and grab your copy of the text, a highlighter, a pen and also a notepad if you are making notes of any key quotations that we go through. This particular chapter is quite short. In terms of key quotations, there aren't that many, but it is pivotal in terms of the events and the character arc of Dr. Jekyll as well as Dr. Lanyon. So let's get into it. Time ran on. Thousands of pounds were offered in reward for the death of Sir Danvers was resented as a public injury, but Mr. Hyde had disappeared out of the ken of the police as though he had never existed. So the word ken here means knowledge, so the knowledge of the police as though he had never existed. Much of his past was unearthed, indeed all disreputable. Tales came out of the man's cruelty, at once so callous and violent, of his vile life, of his strange associates, of the hatred that seemed to have surrounded his career, but of his present whereabouts not a whisper. From the time he had left the house in Soho on the morning of the murder, he was simply blotted out, and gradually, as time drew on, Mr. Utterson began to recover from the hotness of his alarm, and to grow more at quiet with himself. The death of Sir Danvers was, to his way of thinking, more than paid for by the disappearance of Mr. Hyde. Now that that evil influence had been withdrawn, a new life began for Dr. Jekyll. He came out of his seclusion, renewed relations with his friends, became once more their familiar guest and entertainer, and whilst he had always been known for charities, he was now no less distinguished for religion. He was busy, he was much in the open air, he did good. His face seemed to open and brighten, as if with an inward consciousness of service, and for more than 2 months the doctor was at peace. So here we've got the correlation between the appearance of Hyde and the appearance of Jekyll, which is very, very clear. When Hyde seems to have disappeared, Jekyll comes back into society. Even though no justice has been served for Sir Danvers Carew, there is a sense of great relief for Dr. Jekyll at the disappearance of Hyde. On the 8th of January, Utterson had dined at the doctor's with a small party. Lanyon had been there. So one really important thing to mention here is by following Utterson's perspective, because obviously this novel is all about Utterson's perspective, or predominantly about Utterson's perspective. The events of the other characters' lives, so Jekyll's re-entry into society, Lanyon's traumatic transformation later on when we see it, occur without warning or explanation, and must be considered together as pieces of a larger puzzle. These sudden changes occur to Utterson as they occur to us as well, and give us a detective's eye in the similar way that Utterson. So it's almost like we are Utterson because of his perspective and voice that we get to see throughout this novel. And the face of the host had looked from one to the other, as in the old days when the trio were inseparable friends. So the three of them, Utterson, Lanyon and Jekyll, are together again. They seem to be good friends again. Remember earlier, Lanyon and Jekyll seemed to have some form of a dispute. Lanyon, for definite, really didn't like him. But here we see that they've rekindled that friendship. So let's continue to read. On the 12th and again on the 14th, the door was shut against the lawyer. So we've got the image of the door again. So the motif of the door, remember we've discussed in great length, hints at the themes of secrecy. Whenever something's not right, we've got this shut door, or we've got closed windows or windowless structures, hinting at the theme of secrecy. The doctor was confined to the house, Poole said, and saw no one. On the 15th, he tried again and was again refused, and having now been used for the last 2 months to see his friend almost daily, he found this return of solitude to weigh upon his spirits. So for some reason, Jekyll's hiding again. He's secluding himself in his house after 2 months of partying and being really sociable, and this is really unsettling for Utterson, but also unsettling for us as the reader, because again we see things from Utterson's perspective, so we can understand why he'd feel unsettled by this. The 5th night he had in Guest to dine with him, and the 6th he betook himself to Dr. Lanyon's. So he goes to Dr. Lanyon's, he dines with Guest to sort of maybe distance himself from Jekyll, who's trying to hide away from him for some reason. There at least he was not denied admittance, but when he came in, he was shocked at the change which had taken place in the doctor's appearance. So here's the change that I mentioned earlier. He had his death warrants written legibly upon his face. The rosy man had grown pale. His flesh had fallen away. He was visibly balder and older. So Lanyon's altered appearance represents another dramatic change. So like that of Jekyll's sudden change from being really social and really happy and clearly very spirited, suddenly isolated and lonely and shutting himself away from everybody. This dramatic change is also seen in Lanyon. This is a good section as well to contrast Lanyon's description that we saw in chapter 2, where he's seen to be full of health and vitality. So in these new descriptions that we get in this section of him, he appears close to death. And it was not so much these tokens of a swift physical decay that arrested the lawyer's notice as a look in the eye and quality of manner that seemed to testify to some deep-seated terror of the mind. It was unlikely that the doctor should fear death, and yet that was what Utterson was tempted to suspect. Yes, he thought, he's a doctor, he must know his own state, and that his days are counted, and the knowledge is more than he can bear. And yet, when Utterson remarked on his ill looks, it was with an air of greatness that Lanyon declared himself a doomed man. I have had a shock, he said. So it's throughout this passage, it's really interesting to notice that how Utterson recognizes that Lanyon is a terrified man, but that it isn't his impending death that frightens him. There's something else that frightens him, something else that unsettles him. But again, Utterson doesn't ask any questions. As we know, that's just the type of character he is, but we should be, as spectators and readers of this, noticing how it's strange that Utterson doesn't question any of this, because he is a lawyer and that's his job, and we've mentioned this before, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. And I shall never recover. It is a question of weeks. Well, life has been pleasant. I liked it. Yes, sir, I used to like it. I sometimes think if we knew all, we should be more glad to get away. Jekyll is ill too, observed Utterson. Have you seen him? So he doesn't ask anything. Utterson doesn't ask anything about what shock he's had, what's happened, what's he worried about, what is making him feel this ill. Instead, he just says Jekyll is ill. Has he seen him? But Lanyon's face changed, and he held up a trembling hand. I wish to see or hear no more of Dr. Jekyll, he said in a loud, unsteady voice. I'm quite done with that person, and I beg that you will spare me any allusion to one whom I regard as dead. So at this point, we're reminded of Lanyon's reference to his disputes with Jekyll earlier on when we first met Dr. Lanyon, and also Jekyll's dismissal of him as an ignorant, blatant pedant. So those of you who are aiming for grade 9s, making comments or combining quotations and showing that you are aware of the things that happen and the events that happen and the dialogue that happens between characters is really important, because it convinces the examiner that you know the text really well, and that convincing the examiner that you know the text really well is a really rewarded skill, said Mr. Utterson. And then, after a considerable pause, can't I do anything? He inquired. We are 3 very old friends, Lanyon. We shall not live to make others. So again, he's not asking what's happened, what's the matter. Instead, he says, is there anything I can do to help? So he's not really using his questioning skills as a lawyer to get to the bottom of it. Nothing can be done, returned Lanyon. Ask himself. He will not see me, said the lawyer. I'm not surprised at that, was the reply. Some day, Utterson, after I am dead, you may perhaps come to learn the right and wrong of this. I cannot tell you, and in the meantime, if you can sit and talk with me of other things, for God's sake, stay and do so. But if you cannot keep clear of this accursed topic, then in God's name, go, for I cannot bear it. So clearly, Lanyon is very distressed. He doesn't want to talk about Jekyll. The topic really upsets him. But Utterson isn't being a very good friend by not asking him exactly what's the matter with him, what's upsetting him so much. Instead, he kind of shrugs it off. As soon as he got home, Utterson sat down and wrote to Jekyll, complaining of his exclusion from the house and asking the cause of this unhappy break with Lanyon. And the next day brought him a long answer, often very pathetically worded, and sometimes darkly mysterious in drift. The quarrel with Lanyon was incurable. I do not blame our old friend, Jekyll wrote, but I share his view that we must never meet. I mean from henceforth to lead a life of extreme seclusion. You must not be surprised, nor must you doubt my friendship, if my door is often shut even to you. You must suffer me to go my own dark way. I have brought on myself a punishment and a danger that I cannot name. If I am the chief of sinners, I am the chief of sufferers also. I could not think that this earth contained a place for sufferings and terrors so unmanning. And you can do but one thing, Utterson, to lighten this destiny, and that is to respect my silence. So notice how Lanyon used religious terms as well. You know, he constantly mentioned God when he spoke to him. Here Jekyll is mentioning punishment and sinners, you know, religious language used here by men of science to show how they're fully aware that there are repercussions, so there are consequences in the afterlife, or they have a God to answer to. So despite there not being much of a mention about religion throughout this novel, there is that battle between science and religion, and clearly these characters are very much aware of their retribution, or their need for retribution, or their need to change, or the need to be good in order to please God. Also, again, it is difficult to picture Jekyll's grief from behind the mysterious mask of his letter writing here. Though he hints at horrors, he always stops short of providing any sort of Utterson with a helpful detail, and we are left to imagine why someone so adept at being sociable is being forced into seclusion. So what is it that's making him feel forced into seclusion? Jekyll's withdrawal from his friendships and society is a prime example of the repression, so remember we've spoken about the theme of repression, that Stevenson's characters practice throughout this novel. Utterson was amazed. The dark influence of Hyde had been withdrawn. The doctor had returned to his old tasks and amities. So amities means friendships. A week ago, the prospect had smiled with every promise of a cheerful and an honoured age, and now in a moment, friendship and peace of mind and the whole tenor of his life were wrecked. So great and unprepared a change pointed to madness, but in view of Lanyon's manner and words, there must lie for it some deeper ground. So both of his friends have really changed. Dr. Lanyon has gone through a physical change. He's distanced himself again from Jekyll. There's clearly been something that's happened between him and Jekyll. Jekyll has removed himself away from his social gatherings, his parties, his friendships. So both of these friends of Utterson have changed. Something has happened. A week afterwards, Dr. Lanyon took to his bed, and in something less than a fortnight he was dead. The night after the funeral, at which he had been sadly affected, Utterson locked the door of his business room, and sitting there by the light of a melancholy candle, drew out and set before him an envelope addressed by the hand and sealed with the seal of his dead friend. Private, for the hands of G.J. Utterson, alone, and in case of his predecease, to be destroyed unread. So it was emphatically superscribed. So again, we've got these letters. Not only is the novel pieced together with letters that disguise the truth of their authors, but these documents themselves are hardly straightforward. Each carries with it conditions for opening and instructions for its next reader. So there's always conditions, there's always instructions involved. And the lawyer dreaded to behold the contents. I have buried one friend today, he thought. What if this should cost me another? And then he condemned the fear as a disloyalty and broke the seal. Within there was another enclosure, likewise sealed, and marked upon the cover as not to be opened till the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll. So these letters are there's almost like a Russian doll effect of sealed envelopes within sealed envelope, giving a sense that the mystery is unending, is continuing. Utterson could not trust his eyes. Yes, it was disappearance, here again, and as in the mad will which he had long ago restored to its author, here again were the idea of a disappearance and the name of Henry Jekyll bracketed. But in the will, that idea had sprung from the sinister suggestion of the man Hyde. It was set there with a purpose all too plain and horrible, written by the hand of Lanyon. What should it mean? A great curiosity came on the trustee to disregard the prohibition and dive at once to the bottom of these mysteries. But professional honour and faith to his dead friend were stringent obligations, and the packet slept in the inmost corner of his private safe. So we've got the use of personification of the letters here to make it seem like they're also characters, like the fog that we've discussed earlier. These objects or things are also almost like characters that help to unravel the plot and events in the novel. The strange relationship between Lanyon and Jekyll has become more than professional rivalry here. There's been some events so horrific that Lanyon could not recover. In contrast to the reality of this consequence, the remainder of Lanyon's knowledge is hidden and covered up with more letters and documents. So these letters really hint at the themes of secrecy and reputation and keeping things hidden. It is one thing to mortify curiosity, so mortify here means to control curiosity, another to conquer it, and it may be doubted if from that day forth Utterson desired the society of his surviving friend with the same eagerness. He thought of him kindly, but his thoughts were disquieted and fearful. He went to call indeed, but he was perhaps relieved to be denied admittance. Perhaps in his heart he preferred to speak with Poole upon the doorstep and surrounded by the air and sounds of the open city, rather than to be admitted into the house of voluntary bondage, and to sit and speak with its inscrutable recluse. So Utterson has just lost a really dear friend, and now he's being sort of kept away from another dear friend, but instead of missing this other friend of his, he's kind of feeling relieved that he doesn't have to see him, almost like he knows there's something not right there, but he doesn't say anything. He keeps it a secret. He doesn't really talk about it. He also doesn't try to help Jekyll, try to see if he's okay. It's very, very strange, all of these relationships between these bachelor men, and we've discussed the importance of bachelorhood and what it could imply earlier as well. Poole had indeed no very pleasant news to communicate. The doctor, it appeared, now more than ever confined himself to the cabinet over the laboratory, where he would sometimes even sleep. He was out of spirits, he had grown very silent, he did not read. It seemed as if he had something on his mind. Utterson became so used to the unvarying characters of these reports that he fell off little by little in the frequency of his visits. So until this point, Utterson has been a detective, drawn on by loyalty and curiosity, both personal and professional, to seek out the truth. But now the true extent of these characters' repression become evident, so this theme of repression, we see it again, as faced with the prospect that Jekyll's situation defies rational explanation to such an extent that the shock of finding it out could kill Lanyon. Even the steady Utterson withdraws from the problem, so instead of getting closer to the problem, instead of trying to figure out what it is, continuing to be the detective, trying to be a good friend, trying to be a good professional person, he moves away from it. He leaves it, which is really, really interesting. Why do you think he does this? Does this show repression? Does this show secrecy? Does this show loyalty? What do you think? I'd like you to answer that question in the comments below. So that is the end of this chapter. If you've enjoyed this video and you found it useful, then please remember to like and subscribe to our channel. I will be uploading weekly videos on the next chapter of Jekyll and Hyde in next week. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.